We Love Katamari is the direct sequel to the cult classic PS2 game Katamari Damacy. Although there were a number of games made in the series after We Love Katamari, this will be the last game I'm covering since it's the only game other than the original that was made with the involvement of Keita Takahashi. It's well documented at this point that Mr. Takahashi wished to move on to a new project after Katamari Damacy, but didn't since he was told by Namco that a sequel would be made with or without him. He decided to work on the second game as to uphold a standard of quality and maintain some sense of creative control. Seeing as Katamari Damacy was released in 2004 and We Love Katamari in 2005, one could safely infer that Namco was approaching Katamari as a franchise that could produce low-risk but high-yield investments for the company, giving them a beneficial return. In my last video of the series, I brought up Hideo Kojima as an example of an auteur, and he ran into a quite similar problem after each Metal Gear Solid game. Time and time again, he announced during interviews that each game was his last installment in the series, and he would be moving on. But it's quite hard to relinquish control of your creation, especially if you're intimately involved in the process of its development. You might be all too aware of the fact that there may not be any other people employed by your company that could do justice to the work without sullying your original intentions. This is the paradox of the creative person. When they create something that the public happens to find notable, investors crave more of the same with small variation, since human cognition is largely based in pattern recognition and categorization. Namco knows this all too well and look to invest in the fact that most consumers will be confident that their money will be well spent in a product that has proven to be of interest to them. If Namco were to spend more money, they want to see more Katamari, as opposed to starting from the ground up with a fresh idea that posed financial risk. If we try to empathize with Keita Takahashi's perspective, it must be disheartening to see a company capitalize off your creation. I don't mean explicit financial envy, but in a creatively stagnating way. Namco took a risk bankrolling such an ambitious work, and the money Katamari made wasn't being used to enable creatives to try something new, only produce more. That being said, We Love Katamari turned out to be a very strong game in its own right. And due to the lessons learned during the development of the first game, positive changes were implemented to make the game feel interesting and different. Just like my video on the first game, this will not be a review, merely a discussion of aspects of the game. Unlike my first video, I think you should play the game before watching this because the story plays a more foregrounded role. In the effort of comprehensively covering my thoughts about the game, I'll discuss the story in detail, effectively spoiling it for newcomers. I highly recommend players complete Katamari Damacy before playing We Love Katamari, as it's a direct sequel that contains lots of meta discussion pertaining to the fan base's reaction to Katamari Damacy. Also, the two games are so close technologically that if you're willing to go back 13 years to play a game, you might as well be willing to go back 14 to play its predecessor. Overall, We Love Katamari is a wonderful game. When I think back to the series, oftentimes I reminisce on We Love Katamari as opposed to the original game. It's a game that anyone can enjoy, and like the original, it's an unforgettable experience in its own right. The core mechanics in We Love Katamari remain the same as its older sibling. The word that kept springing to mind when replaying the game is refinement. On a moment-to-moment basis, We Love Katamari plays almost like an expansion of the original game. It's the same basic structure you know and love, but with more interesting content and wise design choices that enhance the gameplay without radically evolving into a new, unrecognizable experience. Pound for pound, I think we could make a compelling argument that We Love Katamari is more fun to play. It's less cumbersome, the levels are more varied, and the player is meant to be more invested in the story and lore of the game. Depth of field was always a problem in Katamari Damacy. During the size transitions before the camera scaled back and the player got access to larger objects to roll up, the screen became very cluttered with the Katamari in the middle. As the PS2 outputs a 4:3 aspect ratio, the screen is more or less square, and the Katamari is centered in the middle, which took up too much of the on-screen real estate. In We Love Katamari, the Katamari center is no longer the focal point. The prince and his clump are moved slightly closer to the camera, while the camera seems to have been moved higher up. This change makes the game so much easier to play. Objects directly in front of you are much less obscured, and the higher camera angle gives the player more control. Another worthwhile addition to the game is the play again option after levels. This can alleviate the need to retraverse the overworld and sit through dialogue multiple times if you want to replay a level for whatever reason. It also feels like the inertia of a heavy Katamari is slightly less drastic. You have more control over movement at all times, even in the water levels, when moving in all 3 dimensions is part of the game, rather than just moving on an XY axis. This level isn't a prominent part of the game, which in my opinion is a good thing. It's not the most fun level to play, but it's a nice change of pace. The navigation is just well enough tuned to get through the water level in the beginning and the space level at the end. During the space level, it feels as if you're rolling on the inside face of a sphere which revolves around the sun, since it only has an implied depth, not an actual z-axis like the underwater level. Again, this is an interesting change of pace and is more of a set-piece level than an actual focal point of the game, so it remains interesting, although I am glad that the majority of levels retain their traditional structure. Some of the more memorable levels give non-traditional Katamaris to the prince with a non-standard goal, like the level where you have to roll up fireflies to help a young man study in the dark, or another level when you roll up items during a race with a Katamari that doesn't stop moving and will not stay stagnant. The small model of the prince in the lower right hand of the screen was also used to greater effect in the sequel. While in the first game there was hardly any changes to the prince at all, now we have more dynamic information being displayed through the UI. It doesn't make much of a difference while playing the game as no essential information is placed there, but it's small details like this that add even more character to this incredible world and show that the devs really cared to improve upon their vision. During the course of the first game, cousins could only be collected after the player had finished the game, which was fun and provided some replay value, but in We Love Katamari, cousins can be rolled up at any time, and replay value is added by giving players new time-based goals for replaying levels, which is fun and I would imagine very helpful to speedrunners in addition to a few other post-game unlockables. Another new change is how the player traverses its world. On a macro scale, the player's interaction with the world is meant to be tangibly different. No longer do we have planets that serve as an interactable trifecta of function where each area is meant to represent a different facet of the game. We have a connected world that unifies all elements of gameplay. The cousins, multiplayer, level select, and system menus are all available along one scrolling area, which simplifies the player's integration with the menu and makes it more accessible while retaining functionality. While it was a cool feature in the original, levels are no longer represented by icons scattered across the globe. I assume this was done for 2 reasons. First, I think this will mislead players less and suspend us in the hyper-stylistic universe to a greater degree, since you wouldn't walk on the globe selecting a level in South Africa and load into a stage with a suspicious amount of kanji. Second, it supports one of the main themes of the game, person-to-person connections. Players don't select a level to play, they select a person to help. On a level-to-level scale, the goal isn't always getting larger and larger over a series of levels, but to fulfill the requests of each character that populates our overworld. In turn, creating more celestial objects to roll up in the effort of eventually rolling up our sun. The objective of consuming Earth's favorite star is presented to the player early in our time with the game, but is unachievable as we haven't cleared enough levels and haven't created enough planets, comets, constellations, and the like. I think this was done to send the message to the player, don't worry, you'll be able to roll up very large objects eventually, but for now, enjoy the ride. Other than the constellation levels in the first game, each level would have you start with a larger Katamari, give you more time, or a larger goal. I'd be lying if I told you these goals aren't fun, but having a more varied palette of levels with unique objectives makes each level more singular and memorable. If the devs only went for size goals in the sequel, I think it would have been disappointing to fans. The only real forward momentum in this kind of sequel would be by rolling up a much larger Katamari than the first game, and providing players with even more interesting objects to roll up. If that were the case, I don't think this game would be very memorable at all. Just another few levels to complete in the same vein. Fortunately, players of We Love Katamari will be able to enjoy the varied levels, see even more objects in the first game, and roll up a much larger Katamari, which really encapsulates the best of all the series has to offer. To briefly recap the events of the first game, in the opening cutscene, the King of the Cosmos accidentally destroys all the celestial bodies near Earth, and tasks the prince with creating new ones by way of rolling Katamaris that the king makes into stars. In parallel with the prince fulfilling his duty, a mother, son, and daughter travel to visit the father of their family and see him launch into space on a rocket ship. To their surprise, the launch is cancelled as it's discovered that the moon has disappeared from orbit. During the final level, we roll a very large Katamari and create a new moon on which the family hangs out on during the postgame.
And that, dear friends, was the plot and purpose of the fabulous game called
Katamari Damacy!
The story vignettes presented between levels are focused solely on this family during the span of time on Earth. We Love Katamari is very different. It focuses less on current events in favor of divulging the events of the past. The game tells the story of how the King of the Cosmos met his bride-to-be and became king by succeeding his father. This is an interesting choice considering it makes all parties involved much more finite. If we were never told the story, the king would have retained that unknowable coolness he possessed in Katamari Damacy. During the course of the first game, we could insert any hypothetical backstory for the mysterious fan-favorite character, but now the narrative is set and the veil is lifted to a degree. Not all questions are answered in this game, like how did he get so big and what are the actual extent of his powers, which to me is a good thing since it gives the person holding the controller something to ruminate upon even for a moment. I know I'm framing this story in a negative light, but I really don't think it's a bad story and I do enjoy it. As a grown man, I have a hard time justifying why seeing someone get their pompadour cut off is so enjoyable, but nonetheless, it is. It's also great to get more information on the Queen of the Cosmos, as she only appeared briefly in cutscenes during the first installment in the series. While I did say just a moment ago that all parties involved became much more finite, the only exception to that is the one character that really matters the most from the player's perspective, the prince. The prince is still a tabula rasa player insert, and I think that's a good thing. One of the most tonally dissonant features of Katamari Damacy that I neglected to talk about in my last video is actually not in the game itself, it's in the game's manual. On page 30 there's a pseudo tips and tricks section presented in the format of a Q&A between the prince and the king. I'm not sure if this was included in the original Japanese release of the game, it might have been a product of the localization team, but it begs the question, why have the only character involved in the story that says nothing ask banal questions in the back of a manual? It would have made much more sense for the king to talk at the prince than engage in a dialogue with him, since that's how the character acts in the game. This discrepancy was fixed in the manual of We Love Katamari, as no such section was included. It's interesting to me that the story of We Love Katamari almost has nothing to do with the prince overall. He's just a conduit of the king's will, and the story beats presented during the game build on the king's character alone. I think there's something to be said about the absurdity of the story of Katamari Damacy. I really enjoyed how the cutscenes we watched pertain to a totally unrelated family. It offers a quaint, slice-of-life tale that's a departure from the surreal gameplay and isn't found in the story of We Love Katamari. I don't think either one or the other is objectively better. Both stories are told in bite-sized snippets that are memorable enough to get the story across, but don't take you out of the action for too long. Another one of the major shifts in tone from the first game is how the king is presented. Instead of being some sort of nonchalant, cool guy dad who's still a harsh critic, he's oftentimes put into a position where his humility shines. At the beginning of each level, he's reluctant to roll, but is always goaded on by the flattery of his fans, and changes his tune suddenly, showing an enthusiasm to help those who look up to him. In a fourth wall-breaking sequence during the game's introduction, we're told that there was a first Katamari game and it had many fans. The king states that he's expanding his cosmos to please his new fans. From the first moments of the game, it becomes clear that to some degree, the king is an allegory for Keita Takahashi himself. While the king is still painted as an over-the-top, larger-than-life figure, he never turns down a fan, and is always honest and humble in their presence. At first, I thought that showing the future king fail and disappoint his father in the boxing ring was an odd moment for the character, since it humanized this godlike being, but seeing the king as Keita Takahashi made much more sense. In general terms, the story is about accepting failure, going out on your own, growing as a person to overcome your flaws, and making connections with loved ones. If Mr. Takahashi saw some part of himself as the creator of these games in the King of the Cosmos, it makes sense to allow him to fail, learn, and overcome. These are natural parts of life, and the message is clearly articulated in-game through the character that Mr. Takahashi knows his fans love. The recontextualization of the king evolves the narrative that was presented in the first game, where the king and the mother of the Hoshino family are generally dismissive towards children, although the children possess a puerile wisdom and are the real arbiters of change in the world. Although neither of these characters are a real antagonistic force in the game, this shift lets We Love Katamari frame the king's father as the opposing force, moving the king into a more positive light as the player is meant to feel sympathetic towards his plight. I'm not sure if the king was humanized in the effort of letting Keita Takahashi insert some of his own thoughts into the game, or his personality naturally seeped into the equation only after the story was already decided upon, but there's a clear conscientious effort to frame the king as the creator and the fans as the nice people that serve as motivation for the king to continue to do what he does. To come full circle, if we examine what the king did, we find a varied, exciting, and new experience for the fans that the king painstakingly provided. If this isn't a clear message to the fans, I don't know what is. Some fans might not have noted Keita Takahashi's departure from the credits of further games in the Katamari series, but as I said in the beginning of this video, this is the last Katamari game that he was involved in. Just like the king, Keita Takahashi moved on to create a new experience, encouraging us not to trust in the product, a sense of familiarity, or pre-existing intellectual property, but to trust in the person-to-person connection we have made with the creator and embrace their new vision. There's a quote that I remember a friend of mine saying once to an audience at a concert we played together that I often think of. To paraphrase, he said something like, "Whenever you attend a concert where music is being improvised, or buy a CD that has improvisation on it, you aren't really investing in the product that the artist has either recorded or spontaneously created, but trusting in their decision-making process as an artist." I think this is true of someone like Keita Takahashi. At its core, this video series isn't really about either of the Katamari games. It's about the decisions one artist and the developers he worked with have made during the production of these two games. If you need any more convincing in regards to trusting the artists instead of the establishment, go ahead and look on the Apple Store or watch the trailer videos in the description for the endless running game Amazing Katamari Damacy or the freemium clicker game Tap My Katamari, both developed by Bandai Namco Entertainment Europe. Then, watch the video in the description for a game called World, developed by Funnelmania, which Keita Takahashi works for. Which one of these experiences seems more engaging, thoughtful, and creative to you? If you invest some of your preciously limited lifespan experiencing one of these games, which would it be? We Love Katamari is a brilliant game that walks hand in hand with the original. I'm glad I got the chance to experience both of these games, and I would highly recommend them to any of my friends. I think the Katamari series is uniquely positioned to entice people of all ages, those who regularly play video games and those who don't. If you want to experience more of the series, you have some options. Me and My Katamari for the PSP, Beautiful Katamari for the Xbox 360, Katamari Forever for the PS3, and Touch My Katamari for the PS Vita. It bears repeating that my comments regarding the series have not changed since my first video, and I think these games aren't up to the same standard of quality as the first two, but they're available if you're interested. Any information I've used in this video is sourced in the description for further reading. In fact, interviews from this era of Keita Takahashi's work are a little harder to find, as We Love Katamari was less of a breakout hit, as it was a sequel, but nonetheless, Mr. Takahashi says some very interesting things during these interviews that I didn't necessarily cover in this video, as they weren't totally pertinent to my discussion, but are very interesting nonetheless to read. I would like to thank both the development team for making this game and you, the viewer, for taking your time to watch this video. It means a lot to me to have a platform to express my feelings on a subject that I feel passionate about, and I hope to serve as a catalyst for a larger discussion. Next up, I'll be examining Keita Takahashi's next release, Nobi Nobi Boy. If you'd like to stay up to date with the channel, you know how to do that. Thanks again.